Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So this seems to be a particularly festive group tonight. Everyone's chatting and having conversations. I love that. I think one of the most important things about our group, well, aside from the whole thing about saving America, I think that's important. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, that's all up there.
But I think it's really important that we socialize and we have fun and we kind of see each other as a group of people that we like to come and see and come and talk to. So I think it's great the level of interaction and engagement that I'm seeing tonight. So thanks everybody. So is there anybody here who's brand new, who's never been to one of our meetings before? Do you want to say hello?
Welcome.
Thank you.
So I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but Lisa, is there any issues in particular you're interested in, or anything that, besides Haru, that brought you out here tonight?
No, but I'm curious. She always talks about it, so at least I'll get to see it personally.
Well, welcome.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you for your curiosity. We're great people, so I hope you like us.
So we do say it.
Well, I got to be positive. Got to stop us. I know everybody's just eagerly awaiting Bar's press conference tomorrow. You probably got your DVR set already. I'm sure he's going to be completely forthcoming and give all the answers.
And honest.
That'll be quite a relief and honest. Yeah. So that, honestly, that kind of thing really underscores how important our mission is, and our mission is really building toward 2020, not just at the presidential level, but at the congressional level. We really need to work on all levels of power at the federal level next year. So everything we're doing this year, we're learning, we're building our strength, and we're working toward the ultimate goal next year of taking back power and getting things back to the way they should be.
Yes.
Finally. In the meantime, of course, the world is still spinning. There are still important things going on, and there are still major threats, not just to our democracy, but to our entire livelihood. And that's one we're here to talk about tonight. I'm sure everybody here is very familiar with climate change, with global warming as an issue, and we all know that something needs to be done. Well, April happens to be the month where Earth Day is, and we thought that would be the most appropriate time to talk about this. Also, of course, when we did our little issue survey back at the beginning, climate change was right near the top of the list, so we want to make sure that we devote some time to talking about that. So without much further ado, I will introduce environmental scientist and climate journalist from the Citizens Climate Lobby. Please welcome Dana Nuccitelli.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Dana.
I'm Dana. I'm going to start with my background a little bit. So my background's in physics and astrophysics from Berkeley and Davis. And then after I got my master's degree, I shifted gears a little bit and became an environmental scientist. Right around that time, that was about 2006, that's when An Inconvenient Truth came out, Al Gore's film. And so at that time, I didn't really know anything about climate change and global warming, and I went to the Crest Theater, the Tower Theater with my wife, and we saw the film. And I came out of the theater, and I thought to myself, if the science in this film is true, how is it possible we're not doing anything about climate change? Because the film is pretty, it presents the science, and it's like, there's all these threats, and temperature's going like this, and CO2's going like this, and we're not doing anything. So then I spent a few years just kind of reading everything I could about climate science, papers and articles and books, and then I started writing about it in 2010 for a website called Skeptical Science, which is like a myth debunking website. I'll go into that a little bit. And then a few years later, I got hired by The Guardian. They were doing an international environmental blogging network, and so they hired me to write for them. And I did that for 5.5 years, and then just recently I started writing for a group called Yale Climate Connections. And I've written some peer-reviewed climate-related papers in the meantime. It's my spare time, and then as mentioned, I'm a member of the Sacramento chapter of a group called Citizens Climate Lobby that I'll talk about a little bit. I also published this book a few years ago called Climatology versus Pseudoscience. Lots of good stuff in there. Makes a great gift. I highly recommend it. Buy it. Just put my name into the Google or Amazon and it'll pop up, so keep that in mind. I mentioned skeptical science. I'm not going to have much time to talk about science today. I'm actually mostly going to talk about policy because I figured you guys are more interested in climate policy. So If you're interested in climate science, that's a great place to go. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a climate myth debunking database. So we're like a team of international volunteers. Most of us have science backgrounds, and what we do is when we hear a new climate myth, we like look at the peer-reviewed scientific literature and see what that says, and we kind of translate it into simple English, put it in the Skeptical Science database. And so we've got over 200 climate myths debunked in the Skeptical Science database. We've also got a smartphone app, so you can go to your app store and type in Skeptical Science, and then you'll have climate myth debunking at your fingertips on your phone. I mentioned my Guardian blog. It was called Climate Consensus, the 97%. That's the title of it. Wrote it with the blog guy there is John Abraham. He's a climate scientist in Minnesota, so we wrote that for the Guardian. The title was named after one of our papers we found. We looked at the peer-reviewed scientific literature. We found a 97% consensus in the literature that humans are the main cause of global warming since 1950. So we kind of named our blog after that because it's surprising how few people know the consensus is that high. It's like hardly anybody. When you ask people like what percentage of scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, everybody underestimates it like vastly. Like the average answer, well, Americans is 55%. So people think it's like, people think it's like 50-50. It's 97 to 3. And so that's why we named our blog after that. So they kind of spread the awareness of the 97% consensus. Then I mentioned just the end of last year, I started writing for Yale Climate Connections, YaleClimateConnections.org, and actually my first article for them was about the many ways that climate change worsens California wildfire. So I want to talk about that a little bit, just because I'm a science geek, and so I got to talk a little bit about science. And because it's a really important, because people don't really understand how climate change is impacting us like here and now. Like they view it as kind of a distant problem. It's gonna hurt somebody else. It's gonna hurt people in the future, and they don't really realize like how climate change is impacting us today. And so for California, the main way, I mean, there's a lot of ways it's impacting us today, but a big one is making wildfires worse. So this is a table put together by CAL FIRE of the 20 biggest wildfires on record in California. And if you look at the top 10, there's kind of a pattern there. 8 of the top 10 have happened since 2007. So there's this trend of like wildfires kind of getting worse and worse and worse. And then the Camp Fire that just happened last year was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history. And last year was actually overall for the United States was a really bad year for kind of climate exacerbated extreme weather events. So we had Hurricane Florence in September. That ended up being the 3rd costliest extreme weather event in the world in 2018. And the next month we had Hurricane Michael, that was the 2nd most expensive, and then the next month we had the Camp Fire, that was the most expensive extreme weather related event in the world in 2018. So the United States, 1, 2, 3, 3 months in a row had the 3 costliest, most damaging extreme weather events in the world last year, which is pretty crazy. So yeah, top 3. We're number 1, right? So yeah, that's not, unfortunately, that's not something we'll be number 1 in, but that's where we were last year. This chart is it's also data from CAL FIRE, and it's of the acreage burned by wildfires in California every year since 1987. So you can see there's a lot of variability year to year. It goes up, it goes down, because some years are hotter, some years are colder, some are wetter, some are drier, and so the variability has a lot of effects on the year to year wildfire acreage burn, but there's a long-term trend. That's the long-term trend going up, 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 up. On average, wildfires are getting bigger and bigger over time. And you can see the biggest bump over there on the end, that's 2018. It was the year with the biggest acreage burned by wildfires in California on record. So there is this long-term trend of California's wildfires just getting bigger and bigger. So the question then is, what's causing that increase? And there's a lot of confusion about that, and I'm going to give one example of the confusion about that. So I believe this was either during or right before the campfire. I think it was during the campfire. The president was in Paris and it was raining, so he couldn't go outside because it's like the Wicked Witch of the West or something. And so he was in his hotel room. He was tweeting, of course, and he started tweeting about California wildfires. And he was like, well, if they would just do forest management, then it wouldn't be a problem. And so they should just do that. And then I think the next day he did it again. If they just did forest management, they would not have a problem. California needs to get smart. And then actually, I think it was in January, he kind of did it again, came back to it, and he was like, oh, they're getting all this FEMA money. We're going to take their FEMA money away if they don't start to do forest management. And so basically, this is an argument you hear from the president and from other Republicans that if California were just do forest management, then we wouldn't have these increase in wildfires. And so there's like a scientific term for that argument. That's baloney. So, like, I don't want to like totally downplay forest management because it is an important factor in changing wildfires. For a long time, we overdid fire suppression. So when there's a wildfire, we would immediately put it out, and so then like naturally when there's wildfires, it just kind of burns off some of basically the fire fuel because it's burning off some of the stuff, and then so there's not as much fire fuel left over for the next fire, and so we kind of overdid it, and so there was kind of a problem with like overdoing that fire suppression. And other forms of forest management are important, but it's not the only factor at play. And so there was a good report on this. It was called the 4th National Climate Assessment Report. It came out right around the same time. It was actually published on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. There was a good story from one of the scientists who wrote about this. It was scheduled to be published in like mid-December, and then suddenly the scientists got the order from somebody above them that we need to publish it on Black Friday, and this was like 2 days before Thanksgiving. And so this Catherine Hayhoe, who's this great climate scientist, was like baking pies for Thanksgiving, and she'd like put her pies aside and like finish proofreading her chapter and get it published. Because you can imagine why the administration wanted to publish it on Black Friday. That kind of backfired because then there was a story that they're trying to suppress this report by publishing on Black Friday, and that itself became a story. So then it was in the news for like weeks on end, which was great. So that report kind of breaks down the country by region, and it looks at climate change impacts to each region, and we're in the Southwest region. And so in that region, they had some great stuff on what's causing the wildfire increase. So I had this quote, and it says, "Climate change has led to an increase in the area burned by wildfire in the western United States. Analyses estimate the area burned by wildfire from 1984 to 2015 was twice what would burn had climate change not occurred. Furthermore, the area burned from 1916 to 2003 is more closely related to climate factors than to fire suppression, local fire management, or other non-climate factors." So those other factors are playing a role, but the single biggest factor causing this increase is climate change. And they had this nice chart to go along with that chapter, and it kind of shows the cumulative area burned by forest fires since 1984, that same date we looked at before. And so since it's cumulative, it's adding up like this year to all the previous years, and so that's why it goes up every single year. And so the yellow line is how much acreage would have burned by wildfires in the western United States without climate change, and then the orange area is the increased area burned due to climate change. So you can see, it's about twice as big. There was about twice as much acreage that burned as would have if climate change had not been occurring. So that's pretty much the end of my science, which it's tough for me because I like talking about science. And that's a really important factor. So right there, it's really, the science is really clear that climate change caused by humans is increasing this area burned. There's a couple of specific ways it's doing that. One is that basically just when temperatures are higher, that makes more evaporation happen and it dries everything out. So that basically just creates more wildfire fuel. And then the other way is that it's actually shifting California's rainy season. So more of our rain is getting concentrated in the winter months, December, January, February. And we're getting less rain in March, April, May, and less rain in September, October, November. And so basically it's making the wildfire season that much longer because the rain kind of stops earlier and it starts later. And so we already have like a natural drought every year in the summer. We don't get any rain in the summer. And so now we're not getting any rain in the spring and not very much rain in the fall. And so basically by the time we get to like November, it's been a long time without any rain, everything's really dry, and there's more fuel for wildfires, which is why like the Camp Fire happened in November. The year before there was like a record wildfire in December, and these are months where we never used to see really big wildfires because that's usually when we had a lot of rain. We just haven't been getting as much rain in these months anymore, so longer wildfire season means worse wildfires happening at the end of the season. And the end of the season is happening later and later. Okay, now we're gonna shift to kind of like policy and how to, basically what we need to do to solve the problem. So this is a chart I put together of where we've gone so far. So this is CO2 emissions basically since the Industrial Revolution. So you can see that it kind of went up, and then we hit World War II, and then after World War II, everybody developed really fast. We put a bunch of coal power plants into place, used a bunch of energy, and CO2 emissions shot up really fast, and that's where we are now. And so the Paris Climate Agreement, we decided we want to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. Right now we're at about 1 degree Celsius, so we're halfway there. And so if we want to do that, we have to do something like that. That's basically what the carbon dioxide emissions pathway has to look like if we're going to stay within the remaining carbon budget, is what they call it, to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. And so you can see, like, the emissions went up really fast. They need to go down even faster than they went up. So we need to do a really rapid, radical change moving away from fossil fuels. And even 2 degrees Celsius has a lot of impacts and risks. Like we're already seeing all the impacts associated with 1 degree Celsius. 2 degrees Celsius is basically twice as bad. And so in the Paris Agreement, like a lot of island nations especially, that they're vulnerable to sea level rise, they said 2 degrees Celsius is not okay for us. We want to get closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so that's kind of a more aspirational target. If we want to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that curve gets even steeper and you have to get down to 0 really fast by around mid-century. And so kind of puts just into perspective how urgent and rapid of a shift we need to make if we're going to limit global warming to these levels that we're trying to do. So to make that happen, you need different policies. Okay, we got a little bit about economic impacts in here too. So this is a chart I put together. The last IPCC report, which is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, best climate scientists in the world coming together every 5 to 7 years, they put together a report. In that last report, they looked at 4 different scenarios. So basically the blue one, that's basically the pathway to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. That's our Paris target. The red one is kind of if we do some climate policies, but we're too slow and we miss the Paris climate targets and get to more like 3 degrees Celsius, and there's a couple more. This purple one is if we basically totally fail at climate policies and just burn a lot of fossil fuels, and that's kind of a bad one. So there's just a really interesting paper out actually by some EPA scientists, which I thought was fascinating. The EPA scientists are still allowed to publish some climate-related research, but good for them, keeping their heads down and doing their work. I like that. So it's actually what my next article for Yale Climate Connection is going to be on. And they looked at the difference between these 2 scenarios they looked at 22 different climate impacts on the economy. So it's not like comprehensive, but 22 is still a lot of big climate impacts. And basically what they found was that by the end of the century, 2090, the difference in annual climate damage costs between those 2 scenarios, if we get to this one as opposed to that one, the difference is over $200 billion per year. And so you're looking at
That's just in the U.S., right?
just in the U.S. This is just U.S. economic impacts from climate change. And so if you add it all up, it's like
What is RCP?
RCP. It's a representative concentrations pathway. It's just a scenario, and it's complicated to explain, but yeah, it's just these different scenarios that I looked at. And so if you add it all up, basically the difference cumulatively from now until the end of the century is about $10 trillion, and that's not even looking at every climate impact, just these 22, and just in the United States. And so it's a really expensive thing so one really important thing is when people talk about climate policy, they talk about how expensive the climate policy is, and the argument by Republicans is always it's going to kill a job, and it's going to cripple the economy, and we can't afford it. And so, well, if the argument on the other side is that if you don't do anything, then it's going to cost like over $10 trillion by the end of the century, and that's a lot of money. So it's important to bear in mind not just, it's important to do a economically effective climate policy, but it's also important to do a climate policy so you're avoiding these trillions of dollars of climate costs.
Can you give the title of that article at some point? So
If you guys send me an email, I can. If you see me afterwards, I'll give you my card and I can send you. Yeah, I don't remember the title off my top of my head. So they broke it down in that paper, those costs, and most of the costs came down to health impacts. The most important one was related to heat deaths per year. Basically, it gets so hot that people who are more vulnerable to heat stress, they die more often. And that's a tricky thing. They actually had to quantify the costs of all those deaths. And there's this thing called the value of a statistical life that the EPA uses, which I have a little bit of trouble with that because it's kind of morally fraught to be calculating the value of a statistical human life. But in any case, that was the biggest cost, and just from a moral standpoint, that is also the biggest cost. And I think it's important to bear in mind that we always like to talk about climate costs in terms of dollars and cents, but like things like lives and suffering and trauma that come with climate change, you can't put a dollar value on those, so that's always important to bear in mind.
It seems to me that it would also cause a lot of migrating from very hot areas to go
Yes.
somewhere else, which is going to be an overabundance of people who are available for work, and it's going to cause a lot of. Am I right on that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, climate change, like it's already impacting migration from Central America, for
Right.
example. So
But
there's
just
certainly
within
more costs.
the United States, right?
Yeah. We're going to have people from Central America more often because there's going to be more frequent droughts in Central America, so they're going to be forced to migrate somewhere, and they're going to come north, and so that is
Yeah.
another potential cost for the United States. That wasn't included in this particular study, but that is, I mean, there's loads and loads of different climate costs, yeah. So health is the big one. There's also almost 1 million lost labor hours per year. This is all per year again. That's $75 billion per year because it just gets too hot for people to work as much. So at some point the temperature is too hot for it to be safe to work outside, and so we lose a bunch of labor hours. We get more West Nile virus because mosquitoes spread. There's a lot of infrastructure costs, obviously along the coast because of sea level rise. You're losing coastal property. That's at the end of the century, $26 billion per year difference between these two scenarios. Road damages because of the heat. More air conditioning is needed, so you have energy costs going up. More flooding. We lose winter recreation because snowpack's disappearing. That's a big problem for here, us in California. The Sierra snowpack's disappearing, which is a problem for winter sports and just for a water supply. That's a really big problem. So there's all these different costs, and that's just an important thing to keep in mind that they pile up and they get really, really expensive really quick. So, policies. Green New Deal is like the big thing right now, so I like to start with the Green New Deal. So there's a lot of confusion about what the Green New Deal is, so it's kind of like a bullet points of what's in the Green New Deal. There's basically a lot of proposed spending on various types of like infrastructure. There's some stuff on building resilience to some of these climate change damages, because there's people have to kind of adapt to these climate change damages, so you have to spend money on that. Green tech, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is an interesting idea that we need to work on. Public transportation, EVs. There's something in there about jobs guarantee, because if we're spending all this money to like change all of our infrastructure, make all of our buildings more energy efficient, that's going to take a lot of work. And so there's going to be a lot of jobs available, so I think a jobs guarantee kind of makes sense there because there's going to be a lot of needed labor for that. So there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of myths and misinformation about the Green New Deal. So there's people are saying you can't take airplanes. There's nothing about there about banning air travel. It's the 40 cows and the hamburgers. There were some like Republican senators who had like a press conference and they were eating hamburgers in the press conference and being like, we're not going to be able to eat hamburgers anymore. No, that's baloney. That's garbage. It doesn't talk about nuclear energy. There's nothing about eliminating nuclear energy. It's not going to cost $93 gazillion. There was some like think tank that was like, oh, it could cost 93. There's no way to put a cost on it because it's not an actual bill yet. It's just like, here's some stuff we need to do, and there's no concrete proposals yet. It's just like, here's what we need to do to kind of, and it was all about, I should mention, it's all about doing like a 10-year mobilization, and the goal of it is to get the United States eventually to become carbon neutral. But that's really all it is. It's just kind of like, here's some ideas of how we can do that with this 10-year, basically government mobilization to make that happen. So there are some good arguments in favor of the Green New Deal. I think the most compelling one is that we just saw how urgent the climate crisis is, how quickly we need to kind of turn things around and get off of fossil fuels. This is the first policy that really kind of grasps the scale of that, because it's like, all right, let's throw a whole bunch of resources at this 10-year mobilization to make that happen. So it really grasps the scale and the scale of the problem. Arguments against it. So Dianne Feinstein didn't like it, and her arguments were that it's not paid for, which is not an argument that I personally like, and that it won't pass Congress, which is definitely not an argument that I like because no climate bill will currently pass Congress. So she was going to do her own version of the green, like she had her like alternative draft Green New Deal, and she was like, this one's going to pass Congress. No, it's not going to pass Congress. So there's not going to be any Republicans who vote for it. So that was kind of a bogus argument. The not paid for, I mean, again, it's not an actual legislation yet, so like hypothetically you could draft up legislation that is paid for if you needed to pay for it, which there's debate about that. So not very good arguments against it in my opinion. And the most important caveat, it's just a resolution. It's just like, here's a framework of things we could do to get this 10-year mobilization to get us on the path to carbon neutrality. It's not an actual bill. It doesn't have specific things like, here's exactly what we're going to do, here's exactly how we're going to pay for it, and things like that. So people really kind of blew that out of proportion and misunderstood it a lot. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on it, I wrote an article about it for Yale Climate Connections, so you can check that out. You can go to YaleClimateConnections.org and look at my stuff. I wrote that in February. So my group, Citizens Climate Lobby, we have a bill that we kind of developed. That's been introduced into Congress. It's H.R. 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It is a revenue neutral carbon tax bill, which is basically you put a tax on carbon pollution and then you take all the revenue that's generated from that and you send it back to households in equal increments. So each household or each person gets the same portion or they get the same size check back. Currently there are 30 House co-sponsors. There is one Republican, which is better than 0, but it's not exactly compelling. So it is technically bipartisan. I'm personally very frustrated that there are not more Republicans on board, because frankly they should really be flocking to this, especially if they think like the Green New Deal is too big government. This is not like a big government thing, this is a small government thing. And so like if Republicans were going to do something serious about climate change, this would be it, and we've got one Republican on board. And so I'm very frustrated by that. So as I mentioned, you put the tax on the carbon pollution, you do it at the source when it comes out of the coal mine or the well, or when it comes across the border, you put a tax on the amount of carbon in it. You send the revenue back to taxpayers with the equal rebate check each month. It starts at it's $15 per ton, which is a very low carbon tax, but it increases very quickly. Each year it goes up by $10 per ton, so it goes up very fast. The reason we do that is we want to start low so it doesn't have like this immediate, really big impact, so people don't like hate it right away, but it builds up over time so you can kind of see what's going to happen very fast, and you can kind of adapt to that. So for example, if you know that gasoline prices are going to be 50 cents more in 5 years per gallon, then you think about which car you're going to buy. You're probably not going to buy like the big gas guzzling SUV. You'll probably buy the more fuel efficient car, knowing what's coming. So it's got targets, and if it doesn't meet these targets, then the price of the carbon tax actually goes up by more. And the target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide 50% by 2034 and 90% by 2050, which is really aggressive and oppressive. That gets us pretty much most of the way to America's contribution to what we need to do to meet the Paris goals. So it's a very effective way of doing a climate legislation. So the kind of the two arguments for it are that it is sort of a compromise bipartisan solution and that it's effective solution. And so the bipartisan one, I'm not so encouraged by that anymore, but it's good policy, which is what I think is more important. Because I mean, at this point, any climate policy that we're going to pass is going to have to be Democrats in 2020. Like they're going to have to take control, and then they're going to have to do what they're going to do. And so I wish that we could do a bipartisan solution, but it's just not looking realistic. And so the question then is, what is the best policy? And I still think this is a really good policy because it's really effective, and it's not bad. It has small economic impact. It's potentially economically beneficial. Has like a much good impact on the economy. And we'll go into that a little bit too. I thought I took this slide out. Okay, this is why it's a compromise, but I'm going to skip that because, as I said, bipartisanship is kind of dead right now. But hypothetically, it's a good bipartisan compromise solution for these reasons. Questions?
So why are there only 29 Democrats sponsoring it?
So, I mean, there's more and more Democrats kind of signing on. Like a couple weeks ago, it was like 20, now it's almost 30. So they're signing on quickly. I mean, they're kind of just deciding like what climate policy do I personally support, and a lot of them, like I think there's like 90 or something signed on to the Green New Deal, so that was kind of a hot thing. Everybody's on the Green New Deal, and you know there's some different. I'm going to go through some other climate bills that have been introduced. So I think the main reason is because it's a compromise. The main reason is that it doesn't spend the revenue on, for example, green projects, on like green research and development and infrastructure. It just sends the money back to households, and a lot of Democrats would prefer to spend at least some of the revenue on, you know, clean energy, for example, things like that, which is a valid point. And you know, a compromise would make it partially revenue neutral, partially spend money on green projects, things like that. But that I think is the main reason why there's not Democrats kind of flocking to it, is because of the revenue neutrality, which is kind of a compromise for them. Because, like for example, in California, we got our cap and trade system. And a lot of revenue from that was spent, for example, on the high-speed rail. And so you have less revenue, and it's from a carbon tax, and you think, okay, well, this is a climate revenue. I want to spend this on other things that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions to reduce climate change. So green energy, public transportation, things like that. So it does make sense, but it's just a question of how best to spend the revenue. And I'm going to talk about that a little more, I think. Yes, I'm going to talk about that right now. So the kind of the case for revenue neutrality is the impact on low income and middle income households is the biggest from a carbon tax, because they spend a bigger proportion of their income on energy. So we did it's called the household impact study of our bill. And so this particular chart shows how much each quintile, so for example, quintile 1 is the 20% of poorest households in America, and quintile 5 is 20% of wealthiest households in America. So this just kind of shows how much money they each spend on basically their carbon footprints. And so you can see obviously the wealthiest people spend the biggest biggest money on their carbon footprints. But, you know, relatively speaking, they're making a lot more money, so it's a smaller percentage of their income than it is down here. So this is the biggest percentage of their income because they're not making much money and they're spending a pretty big chunk of it on energy. And so if you just put a tax on carbon emissions, gasoline prices go up, energy prices go up, and it impacts these poorest people the most. If you're not doing anything, just, you know, send them a rebate or something like that, it impacts them the most.
So, I don't understand the graph. What's the carbon,
So this is,
break it down for me.
yeah, this is basically, I mean, they're breaking it down by category, but it's basically the amount, if you have, this is for our first year, $15 per ton carbon tax. How much that tax impacting each quintile, each 20%. So this is the poorest 20%. This is how much they're spending, how much their tax is each year from their carbon tax. How much they're spending on increased energy, increased, you know, food costs, increased gasoline bills, things like that.
And the tax wouldn't be levied directly on the consumer, it'd be levied on the
Right,
producer.
yeah.
But the assumption is they pass the cost on to the
Right, so
consumer.
you're gonna tax, for example, ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil's gonna pass that along in terms of higher gasoline prices.
Okay.
Question,
Yes.
what is allocated PFI? The light green,
Don't know. That's a good question. PFI, yeah, I don't know. Good question. Not sure. So this chart is also from the same study, and it's basically what it's showing. So the dark gray is the percentage of households in each quintile again. So the dark gray is those for which the revenue the rebate check that they get is bigger than their increase in energy bills from the carbon tax. So in this case, for the lowest quintile, the 20% of poorest households. Again, you're sending the rebate check equally out to everybody. And so for them, because I mean it's a bigger their carbon footprint and their carbon tax is a bigger proportion of their income, but it's a smaller number. You know, it's just $173 as opposed to $300. So for them, when they're getting this rebate check back, for 86% of the lowest income Americans, the rebate check is bigger than their increased energy bills. And another 2% it's about the same, and then for the rest of them, about 12% they come out behind. But 86% of the lowest income Americans come out ahead. For the second, the 20 to 40% of poorest Americans, 72% come out ahead. Once you get to the richest Americans, a very small percentage of them come out ahead. A chunk of them kind of basically break even, and then a bunch of them fall behind. So basically their increased energy bills, because they're spending more on their carbon footprint, their increased energy bills is bigger than their rebate check. So basically what it means is that it's a progressive change to the carbon tax, because basically they're paying more carbon taxes, and that money is getting distributed back more to lower income households. So it allows lower income households to afford the increased energy bills and increased gasoline prices, because they're getting that rebate check, and the rebate check for most of them is bigger than their increased energy bills because their carbon footprint is smaller. It's basically what this last slide shows was that our carbon footprint is basically what we buy, and rich people buy more stuff. So they have bigger carbon footprint, so they're paying a bigger carbon tax, and so the rebate doesn't make them whole, but it does make whole the poorest people. So basically this is our main case for why it's good policy, because for example, we saw in France, they basically did like a gasoline tax, and people hated it because they were just being taxed, and like the gasoline prices are already high, they had a gasoline tax, and then people revolted, they had the yellow vest protests in the streets, and it was because they didn't have any kind of redistribution, they didn't have any kind of dividend, they didn't have anything coming back to them. And so the way to prevent people from absolutely hating, because people absolutely hate it when their gasoline prices go up or their energy bills go up, to prevent that you kind of have to, not just because they hate it and because it's important not to just kind of step on poor people to solve climate change. Doing this kind of rebate check dividend approach is a really good way to do it. So this is why we think it's good policy. So that's kind of my reasoning for why, despite it not being unfortunately effectively bipartisan, I still think it's a good policy, because you have to do something to help out the poor if you're going to put a carbon tax in place.
So has it been tried in any other country or any
Yes, that's a good question. So British Columbia, starting in 2008, did a similar thing. They didn't do rebate checks, but they kind of offset other taxes. And so they did a revenue neutral carbon tax, but the revenue neutrality was done through reducing other taxes. It worked very well. Their greenhouse gas emissions went down. Their economy still did well. It was very popular. I think it was like 65% favorability in British Columbia. And then just this year, it went nationwide in Canada. So Canada is now doing a nationwide revenue neutral carbon tax, except in Canada they are doing it through rebate checks and things like that. So Justin Trudeau is basically banking his next election, which I think is coming up this year. He's kind of banking it on the revenue neutral carbon tax model being effective and popular in Canada. So we're hoping it works well there. So there was we did another study. It was called the Regional Economic Modeling Group. That they break down the country into these different regions and they model it for a given policy. We gave them their policy, we gave them our policy, and we said model what this is going to do to the economy in all these different regions. And so the first thing, because most households, and actually I should go back, overall it's a little over 50% of households and 60% of individuals, the rebate is bigger than their increased energy bills. So most people actually get a net income out of this. And so because of that, because most people get, and the majority of people get net income, they have more real disposable income, which is what this is showing here. In almost every region, people get a bigger rebate check overall than their increased energy costs. And because they have more disposable income, they spend it, which makes employment go up a little bit, and it makes gross regional product, which is kind of the local version of GDP, go up a little bit. These are pretty small changes, but you can see there's one down here. This is the light blue one. That section there, the Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, they use a lot of fossil fuels, and so they have a big oil industry. So it's not a great policy for them. It's important to bear in mind that these are small changes. Like you're talking about less than 1% changes in the economy and employment overall. So plus or minus. I mean, most regions do modestly better. This one region does modestly worse, but either way it's a modest change, which is an important point because again, the argument against climate policy is that it's going to cripple the economy, it's going to kill jobs. And this shows like it's going to have a modest impact either way. It's probably a modestly beneficial impact for most regions, but it's really a modest impact. And that's the important thing, that you put in place this climate policy, it doesn't really have much impact on the economy, but it is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, so it's slowing global warming, and so it's avoiding a lot of those trillions of dollars of climate impacts that we talked about earlier. So really quickly, I'm going to list some of the climate bills that are in place or upcoming. So ours is, I guess, I mentioned HR 763 is our bill. The Green New Deal is that House Resolution 109, Senate Resolution 59. There's also House Resolution 2088, which was Matt Gaetz did the Green Real Deal, which was kind of interesting. Matt Gaetz is an interesting guy. He's this Republican from Florida who wants to abolish the EPA, but he also accepts climate change as real. Because in Florida it's kind of hard to deny because they see in real time they see sea level rise flooding. So he's an interesting guy, but he doesn't like the Green New Deal, so he did the Green Real Deal, which actually had some good stuff in there. It's like we're gonna basically spend on research, innovation, but of course we're gonna reduce regulations, and we're gonna do tax incentives, things like that. So there was some good stuff in there. I mean, it's not really of the scope that we need, it's the magnitude of policies that we need, but at least there was some good stuff in there, so it's it's all right. What the Democrats are trying to do is HR 9, which is basically, this is interesting that, so Trump is trying to pull us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, but to do that takes 4 years, and so technically we're still in the Paris Agreement until, coincidentally, the day after the 2020 election. So that's something to bear in mind in the next election. So until then, technically, we're still in the Paris Agreement, and so HR 9 says, look, we're still in the Paris Agreement, so you need to develop a plan to meet our Paris climate goals. So that's what the House Democrats are trying to pass. I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, it's obviously not going to go through the Senate, but still, it's an interesting idea, and I like the fact that it makes, it takes advantage of the fact that we're still technically in the Paris Agreement. It's kind of like a little poke to the president, which is always good. Senate Bill 1128, there's these 4 Democrats, including Shelley Whitehouse and Christy Gillibrand. So that is a similar carbon tax. I think it's partially revenue neutral, kind of like we talked about. They do some dividends, but they also spend some of the money on other things. So that's an interesting one. White House has actually proposed that for I think several years now. He just reintroduced it last week, so that's an interesting one. Cornyn from Texas, he wants to basically spend money on energy innovation, which is kind of basically the Republican answer to any climate policy, when they kind of mostly stopped denying that we need to do anything. And now when they're pressed on it, they say, oh, we'll just do energy innovation. Innovation is going to solve the problem. So they haven't really gone into details about what they're going to do to spur innovation, because the problem with innovation is it doesn't happen magically. Their argument is our U.S. emissions have gone down since over the past decade or so, which is true. They haven't gone down a lot, but they have gone down. So like we're going in the right direction. So we'll just keep doing that with innovation. That's basically their case. The problem is, as we saw with that curve, is we need to do a lot more than we're doing right now. So you know, and innovation. The problem is like they have to propose what they're going to do to make the innovation happen. So basically, what you need to do is either spend a lot of money on research and development, and or do a carbon tax. Carbon tax basically creates the financial incentive for people to demand the products that's going to lead to more innovation. So basically, innovation doesn't happen magically, so they need to do more than just, you know, we want to do innovation, you have to make it happen. Alexander from Tennessee, he wants to do a Manhattan Project for clean energy, which it sounds good to me. I don't think any Republicans are going to get behind that besides Alexander, which is my problem with it. Like, that's great. Like, I'm glad there's one Republican who wants to spend money on clean energy. The other problem I have with it is that, like, we already have wind and solar and geothermal. Like, we have these technologies available. We need to deploy them. We don't just need to come. This is another kind of basically innovation, but it's like, this is like we're going to make innovation happen by spending money on research. And that's a good idea. I'm all for spending money on research, but we also need to deploy the technologies we have now because, like, we're running out of time. Interestingly, more Republicans are kind of coming on board. They want to do sort of like nationwide clean energy standards. So like a lot of states have like renewable portfolio standards that says like our state needs to get 50% of its energy from clean sources by 2050, for example. And so I'm kind of surprised Republicans like that because that's kind of just like government regulations. But several of them are saying like we should do like a nationwide clean energy standard because I mean they do like wind energy. A lot of Republican states have a lot of wind energy. So that's kind of interesting that they're on board with that. We'll see if that goes anywhere. And then there's this one bipartisan bill that Senator Whitehouse is on board. There's some Republicans like, Joe Manchin's on board with it. Barrasso from Wyoming is a Republican, is on board with it. Basically, it would spend money on research to do direct air capture research. So that's when you basically do some kind of technology that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then uses it for something useful. So the Republicans are on board with that basically because if you're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, it kind of hypothetically gives more time for the fossil fuel power plants to stay in place because, you know, they're putting more in the atmosphere, you're pulling it out, so they're okay, right? So they're like, they want it because they can then make the case that we should keep fossil fuel plants in place and they love the fossil fuel industry. The Democrats like it because we're going to probably have to pull a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so it's actually going to be an important thing to do. So it's a bipartisan bill, which is kind of interesting. We'll see if that goes anywhere. So that's what we got. Question, yeah?
Do any direct air capture or any carbon capture technologies look promising to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's some good pilot projects. Basically, it's like there's one that's like big fans and it sucks air into fans, and then some either pull the carbon out, and then yeah. So there's some technology, some little pilot projects right now. I mean, honestly, the best carbon capture technology is like trees, plants. So like reforestation is really important, but I mean, that can only do so much, and so we're going to technology. We're going to have to do something. So right now, like, it's very expensive to do. That's why we need to do more research to make these things like cost effective. So right now, like, there are technologies that can do it, but they're expensive. So that's why you need the research to make it more cheaper and more cost effective.
Wasn't China doing that?
I think there are some projects in China. There's some in the U.S. I think in Europe. There's various different pilot projects. A lot of countries are very interested. Sorry.
The reforestation.
The Chinese getting behind it.
Yeah, China probably is. I mean, yeah, I mean, the nice thing about China is that they're, I think in large part because they have such an air pollution problem and they're really afraid of like people revolting because the air is so nasty. Like people in China are very serious about climate change. Like they accept human-caused global warming at a much higher percentage than Americans do, and they're doing more about it. So that's actually encouraging that like they're very serious about it because they have a lot of coal power plants too. So they're really transitioning pretty fast away from coal power, just because basically people are forced them to. And I think, they have less of a problem with science now than we do. So
They don't have Fox.
they don't have Fox, which is true. They do have their own government propaganda too, though. They don't have Fox, it's true. So that's actually all I've got. So if you guys have more questions, I'm happy to answer more questions. Yeah. Oh, I should just really quickly mention, it says the Climate Lobby, little plug. We're just a grassroots volunteer group. So if you're interested in our bill or in the group, this is where we meet every month, every second Saturday, except for this one. Actually, I think we're gonna meet this one. So yeah.
Do you know what the cap and trade bill has done in California specifically?
California cap and trade. Yeah, so California, we've done overall a very good job in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. The cap and trade system hasn't done a whole lot of that. We've had a lot of other regulations that have done a lot so far. The problem with the cap and trade system is that right now our carbon pollution price is very low. It's kind of stuck at like it's like $13 a ton. It's just kind of stayed there since basically it was created. So it's gonna be kind of interesting that because the cap part of the cap and trade is like this is how many permits there are, and that number is gonna kind of go down and down and down as we ratchet down and make the cap and trade system more robust. So it's gonna be interesting to see what happens with that. Like the cap and trade system is gonna have to do more, but there's also a lot of issues with the way it was recently extended in a state Congress bill, and there was a lot of like questions about, so for example, because the price was so low, a lot of industries kind of banked a lot of permits. They bought a lot of the permits when they were really cheap, and then the extension of the system allowed them to kind of keep those banked credits, and so even when the price goes up, they'll still have these really cheap credits that they can use. And so there's a question of like how effective is it going to be going forward. So I mean, at some point those credits will run out and then the price is going to go up, and so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with it. So I mean, so far it's worked, but it hasn't had to do a whole lot of the heavy lifting. Like a lot of other regulations have done a lot of heavy lifting so far.
Well, did I understand you correctly that you said California's done a lot of things that have been much more effective?
I mean, California's done a lot of different stuff. We've had a lot of different, air quality and climate policies. I mean, one big thing we've done is just we've kind of forced car fuel efficiency standards very low, and the rest of the country has had to follow us because we are a big market, and a lot of other states have also kind of adapted our fuel efficiency standards. So that's one big thing we've done. We've just had a lot of different policies. California's just kind of been ahead of the curve on climate policy for a long time. The cap and trade system is part of that, but it's only been part of that. We've done a lot of other stuff too. Any other questions? Yes.
This isn't specifically for you, but was anyone at the Sacramento Carbon Zero workshop last Saturday? I'd love to hear more on how that went.
Oh, how about we'll have
After.
folks give a little summary after. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Do you know if our energy bill is gonna go up now that wildfires are gonna cause our energy to go up now because the energy companies are probably gonna spike the price?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, PG&E's basically they had to do bankruptcy because of their liability from the wildfires. And then I know there's some talk from Governor Newsom that he's going to kind of reduce utility liabilities from wildfires because, and it is true, like climate change is making wildfires worse, and that's not the utility's fault. So yeah, I mean, I think at least in the short term, utility bills will probably go up, and in the long term they probably will too. But it kind of depends on how much the utility companies are held liable for the wildfires that like their lines are sparking, but like the conditions have been made worse by climate change, which is all of us, not just the utility companies. So how much liability is theirs, how much liability is ours, and so that's going to be an interesting question going forward to see who's held more liable for that.
So that kind of reminds me, is there any kind of penalties for corporations or businesses that are, just exploiting, the air and
So
climate?
yeah, I mean that's basically what a carbon tax would do. That would be their penalty would be, you're putting your products are putting carbon pollution in the atmosphere, you have to pay for it. Right now they don't pay for it, and that's really the problem. And like economists hate this because it's like it's like a market failure. It's an economic externality because we pay for these costs, like those billions of dollars of wildfire costs and hurricane costs. Like we pay for those as taxpayers. We have to pay for disaster relief and firefighting and all these like costs, but like we're the ones footing the bill, not the energy industry, not the fossil fuel industry. And so that's the whole point of putting a carbon tax in place is that so that
They bear some of the cost of
it's
what
like,
they
so the cost of the products that are causing the problem,
Right.
the cost is reflected in their price. Right now, we're talking about $4 a gallon gasoline as being expensive, but that's actually like really cheap because it doesn't reflect the actual climate change costs of burning a gallon of gasoline. And so, yeah, exactly. Like you need to put a price on carbon pollution so that is reflected in the price.
There may be time for one more question.
It's yours.
Has there been any analysis of what the cost is of Trump's policies, how much worse he is making things. I know that's probably very difficult because a lot of the regs have done, they're gotten rid of silently.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is a lot of it is just kind of, because they'll kind of try to pull back, because like the big example is the Clean Power Plan. Obama administration put the Clean Power Plan in place,
Right.
and then it got, brought to court, and then the Trump administration is kind of like letting it kind of die in court. And so, I mean, the question is like, it's kind of in legal limbo is the problem. So we don't know, like, for example, the next president might kind of put it back in place, and then like it's been a 4-year delay, but like it's only a delay, and so then that has less of a cost as compared to like it just completely dies. And so that's really the problem is like they're trying to do a lot of like unraveling of previous policies, but like they're doing it in a way that just gets, you can tell them in court because they do it in kind of a hand-fisted way, and they don't do it very well, and so it goes to court, and then we have to wait to see what happens in the courts, and so everything's just kind of in limbo. And so, yeah, I mean, emissions are going to be higher than they would have otherwise been had it not been for Trump, but how much higher is kind of hard to quantify because it's all in the legal system.
Oh, thank you so much, Dana. It was very informative. It was really great to hear. And it sounds like we've got a couple different climate bills that are maybe worth giving our legislators a call about. So I know we did ask folks to call about the Green New Deal before, and I think that's still worth calling. Does anyone know offhand if our locals have signed on to that? Obviously Feinstein hasn't.
Doris has.
Doris Matsui hasn't. Okay, great. And I think Senator Harris as well. So, but also it seems like that's not incompatible with what you're talking about. You could do both of them, and you don't have to.
Right.
Yeah,
A lot of the co-sponsors of the Green New Deal are also co-sponsors of our Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act.
And sorry to put you on the spot, but do you know if any of our local electeds, Ami Berra, Doris Matsui, or either of our senators have signed on to?
We are trying to. We are giving them, our own pressure to try to build up their support for it, but they haven't signed on yet. No.
Okay.
None of them. So I think there are like 13 California Democrats who are co-sponsors on our bill, but none of them are local.
So I'll see if I remember this. Doris Matsui's office number is 916-498-5600, I believe. And then Ami Berra is in it like 635. Does anyone know Ami Berra's number?
He's so worthless. I'm so sorry to hear this for him.
Well, if you're in his district, gotta give him a call. Gotta give him a call.
0505.
What's
It's all
that?
on the website.
6350505. And
Very
it's
good.
all on the website.
So 498-5600 if you're in Matsui, 635-0505 if you're in Ferris district. So give them a call. Ask them to support both. Or thank Matsui for supporting Green New Deal. Ask her to support this. So we do have some state legislation we want to talk about tonight. But while we're still on the subject of global warming, we did have an interesting event that we were raising awareness of last weekend. It sounded like at least 3 people went to it. That was the Carbon Zero Sacramento seminar. Does anyone want to, give a brief summary? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it interesting?
Sure. So it was an all-day event, Sac City, and there was a representative of Darrell Steinberg's office, also
Could you
a
stand out of
representative.
Oh, yeah, here, I'll do it all day.
What do we got? Okay. Also,
green screen.
a representative of Cabaldone's office from West Sacramento, and the significance of that is that they got to hear everybody and they got to speak, and so we got some more commitment from them. There were 2 panels, and there were individual presentations and then breakout sessions. And I left there informed about a whole wide array of initiatives and projects. What I didn't get, that I'm continuing to look for, is some of the most highly leverageable ways to make a transition quickly and within the time frame that the IPCC report recommends. We got a myriad of pie in the sky, in my estimation, and more potentially effective ways, but there was no aggregate assessment of where is the best way for us to focus. And that's what I'm looking for personally. and that's what I'm looking for in order to be able to tell everybody that I know. There were a number of points of progress and concern. The Mayor's Commission that you may know about, Mayor's Commission on Climate Change, which is a joint commission between Cobbledome and Steinberg with representatives. There's like 10 people on the commission. Lori Littman from 350.org is one of those people. There was a lot of discussion about the positive value of starting that committee, for one, and the progress that they're making in assessing various ways that our region can move forward in reducing carbon and sequestering carbon. But it became even more clear that people like Lori are pushing the urgency faster than the technical assistance people are recommending. And there was a lot of discussion about, well, what's politically possible.
So it sounds like you really got into the details at this event.
Yeah,
last
and
night.
I won't go any further.
Oh,
Unless you want to. Yeah, there's a lot of details to sift through. And I'll be sifting through those in the next several months. So anybody who wants to sift or hopefully benefit by any sifting that I might do, please let's stay in touch, because this is the primary issue that we all need to address. And if we don't, it doesn't matter about anything else.
how was the lunch, by the way? I heard they provided lunch. Sorry. That's another one of the more pressing issues that we're
It was pressing. But while I'm here, and it's a slight digression, but so I also went to Medicare for All evening that was done by the nurses. They were really excellent. And there was a woman from the nurses union who is on fire with going to Doris Matsui's office and asking, well, you supported Medicare for All last legislative session, why aren't you doing it this legislative session? So a number of us are going to go. If you're a person who wants to be informed of that and go, I'm going to have a sign-up sheet on the back table out there. So I'll put it right there. So before you leave, sign up and I'll get it to the coordinated person.
Thank you, Pat. And but that's not an official Indivisible Sacramento office visit, but we were, an official co-sponsor of that Medicare for All discussion. So it's kind of like a synergy with another group there. Oh, and by the way, that Pat here is our liaison to 350 Sacramento, and he's really becoming involved in these climate change issues. So if you're interested in climate change, someone to work with. Jill, you had a question?
I just want to second what Pat said about connecting, if the climate change issue is something you want to dive deeper into. I think, Indivisible could really benefit from people who are working with some diligent, concentrated focus on that area, that you could keep the group informed and keep us in connection with other local groups that are working on that. And Pat has, embraced it wholeheartedly and is doing the deep dive that he described. So definitely reach out to him if you want to participate in that deep dive and helping us make those connections.
Thank you. So we also have some things going on at the state level, shifting gears a little bit here, but first of all, thank you to everyone who was able to make it out to the Capitol to testify at one of the hearings, or not testify, but give support at one of the hearings. Doug, did you want to give a little shout out to some of those? Or Ellen, I don't know if you had anything to say about this too. Or, okay.
So on the back table, there's a little summary of what's coming up, but next week there's two hearings, one from our good friend Senator Wiener on SB 50, which concerns housing around transit centers and high concentration work centers. That is going to be on the 24th, which is Wednesday. It's currently number 2 on the docket, and it starts at 9 o'clock. SB 47, which is voting reform, which requires all ballot initiative, referendum, or recall signature gatherers and issue ads to disclose top fundraisers. I think this is a very important one. That is going to be on the 23rd, Tuesday, so that's at 8:30 in the morning. If you pick up this little flyer, it'll have the room numbers on there, dates and times, and anybody that would like to join, I'm gonna have a little sign-up sheet in the back. Just meet us on the north steps early in the morning.
Oh, great. We did get a question earlier about that, about our meeting spot. Is the North Steps kind of going to be our designated meeting spot for everything?
So I think that's a good place to
Yeah.
meet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
so the side of the Capitol that faces
L
Uh,
Street.
L Street.
L Street, right.
So
Right. The other good news is that the Presidential Tax and Transparency Accountability Act, which says anybody running for president wants to be on the primary needs to submit their tax returns for the last 5 years. That has moved to appropriations. We won't attend that hearing because it's appropriations and they usually don't take any support, our statements of support. But that's probably going to be moving right straight through. The great news is that AB 392, the police reform bill that is getting a lot of attention, passed public safety last week. Had 2 no votes. I'll let you guess which party they came from. It has moved to rules. There's no hearing, but it should move to the floor very soon for a vote. So stay tuned for that one.
And 230, SB 230, which is the bogus bill, is coming up.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
the
so
opposite of the,
Yes.
Yeah,
or not the opposite,
yeah.
but the
We're
attempt
keeping an
to-
eye on that one too. But last I saw, it was still no movement. So we're still in committee.
Did you hear about a committee assignment, or did you hear?
It's assigned to a committee. It was assigned to public safety, but it hasn't no hearing date or anything. The last I checked, which was a couple days ago.
So Indivisible California State Strong, our statewide policy opposes 230 and supports 392.
Right.
230 is kind of the
Yeah, 230 just says, it's written by the police union. It just says, hey, it'd be nice if we had training. Basically,
It's-
that's it.
it's
Where
their time.
392 says mandatory training and lays down some ground rules on use of deadly force.
Yeah. So yeah, and that that tax transparency bill. First of all, I heard another state is doing that. They might have even passed it, like New York or one of the other states. So that's this is a bill that was introduced in California 2 years ago. It was actually the first bill that Indivisible Sacramento really fought for and took an interest in, and we helped support it, and it got past the Senate, past the House, got to the governor's desk, and then Jerry Brown, for some reason, because he liked to do this kind of thing, he just vetoed it out of nowhere. So
He
we were
said he had
disappointed.
a problem with the Constitution.
Yeah. I think he was in a bad mood that day, actually. But yes.
SB 230 is scheduled for Tuesday, April 23rd, at 8:30 a.m. in room 3191, which is the Public Safety Commission.
Right.
Oh, okay, so
that'll be the same time and date as SB 47. That's good.
Yes.
Oh, great, both
Yeah.
in public
Yeah.
safety.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we can, that's a 2 for 1. One interesting thing about these hearings is that you don't know what order most of the time you don't know what order they're going to do your bill in, so you might have to sit through some others. You might have to, bring a book or something, get comfortable for a while. Or they could do your bill right away and then you,
Well, you can check the agenda. There's
Yeah.
there are published agendas, but they don't always
They don't
follow.
always
them.
stick to
they're
them,
subject
yeah.
to change. I think one time we were supporting one of Senator Wiener's bill. I think you were there, Doug. Where-
net neutrality.
It was
Where it was supposed to be one of the first ones up, but then he was like doing the favor for another senator, and he switched places so that.
It was
his-
the last bill of the bunch.
Yeah. So
It was hideous.
Yeah.
Oh my.
I wasn't there, but I really respect the people who
So-
set it up.
Not to keep talking about the website, but there is a page on the website with all of these bills that California State Strong and Invisible Sacramento are following or whatever. So if you just kind of want an overview of the bills that we're following and interested in, there's a drop down from Legislative Digest. There's a drop down to California Legislative Priorities. If you just want to, there's links to there's all of the bills listed and then links to give you more information.
IndivisibleSacramento.com.
Yeah.
Also, since it's still April, there's also a link to our Act Blue page for the last 13 more days in April. anything you donate to us, we hate to grovel for money, but anything you donate to us will be matched by Indivisible National. So if you're ever gonna kick a few bucks our way, this would be the time to do it. Yes, Karen.
My understanding is that if a bill is listed there on the link that she says, then, and again, I'm speaking on behalf of myself and California, Indivisible California, strong for those that are on there, but we can't say that for anything that's not on there.
Right, yeah,
Right.
and there was a
Some
little
of the
confusion.
things on there are actually just stuff that we support, like SB
Yes.
50,
Okay.
right? So
Right, and
be,
it's-
be double diligent
Absolutely.
that it's state strong.
And
Yeah.
on the website page, we've designated out which
Yeah.
ones are just us and which ones are,
Right.
are us and California State Strong. So-
By the
Yeah.
way, I checked that link, I think it's beautifully done. Whoever did that page did
The
a
Ellen.
beautiful,
The Ellen.
clear
So,
job.
so we do have to credit Doug with a lot of the research on the state bills, and then Ellen with the website. One thing, by the way, that is not on the website, because I haven't told her about it, as you pointed out to me earlier today, is Indivisible's Lobby Day.
Yes.
So all around California, Indivisibles from all around California are invited on the Wednesday after Memorial Day, and I forget, is that the 28th or 29th? It's the Wednesday after Memorial Day. They're going to be congregating up here. There's a small chance it could be changed to the Tuesday, but I was informed that barring something crazy, it's going to be the Wednesday after
Oh,
Memorial
she's
Day.
going back to Wednesday, is she?
Yeah. So that's why I didn't tell you before what the date was, Ellen. It was just, and so I've been enlisted to help them plan and find space and stuff for that. But
They don't have any, they don't have like a Facebook invite or any kind
Not
of
yet.
link where we can.
there will be coming up. We're still planning it. If anyone's interested in helping with the planning for this, by the way, then please let me know.
Excuse me, that Wednesday would be May 29th.
Thank you. May 29th. May 29th, Wednesday. So we're gonna all meet at some location in a meeting room somewhere near the Capitol. They're gonna have some sort of training and like a rally the troops kind of event. We're gonna get lists of bills that Indivisible State Strong is supporting, and then they'll turn us loose on the Capitol, and we'll go knock on senators and assembly members' doors and talk to their staff, and hopefully talk to some of them, and just present them with our list of bills that we support. It's a great opportunity for Indivisible to meet people from all around the state, also a chance to have a little show of force to show that we're a group that you should take seriously. So yes.
Planned Parenthood just had their lobbying day, and they had this great big tent outside.
Oh yeah.
And all that, and they had, I would say, at least 20 of the legislators there in the tent at the
Okay.
early in the morning, and the leader of the of everything called on each of them and why do you support Planned Parenthood? And these individuals would get up there and say, I support Planned Parenthood, but there were over 20 of them
That's
there,
not a
which
bad
was
idea. Get a
very
tent.
impressive.
Get a tent on the lawn, an Indivisible
Yes.
tent. So I have to see how much money they have. But
Yeah,
that's,
just,
that's a good idea. And when I was much younger, I was an intern at the Capitol, and there are like groups that would pitch tents and stuff like pretty much every day there during the certain season of the year. So
yeah.
that's a good idea. We should do that.
So when's our lobbying day?
May 29th.
May 29th.
Wednesday, May 29th.
Okay.
So we'll have more details about that, where to meet and everything as they become available. Just want to put that on everyone's radar, and so that everyone can get it on their calendars. And also, if there's anyone who has a guest room and who has some room to spare, and you want to offer it to someone who may be coming from out of town, that would be helpful too. We'll send out an email about that when we got some state volunteers lists earlier. We got some people that checked the box and said they might be able to do this, but if you're interested, come see me and we'll try to take your name down. Otherwise, we'll send out an email about that later. So, and with that, you've probably heard me talk long enough today. Does anyone else have any questions or announcements? Anything you want to talk about? Did I miss anybody who had something to say? Oh yeah, the sister district.
Yeah.
Yes. Something completely different and something completely different. But a little different. I'm Phyllis Cawley, and I'm the district captain for Sister District Project Sacramento. And I was here before, so does anybody not know what Sister District is? You do. Yeah, it's great. And there are some brochures at the back in case you want to hand any out to your friends. It's got a list of all of our upcoming meetings. And And obviously, to have all these things happening, like climate change, it would be really nice to have congressional districts across the country be fair, get rid of the gerrymandering, so we get the right people in Congress. So that's really our game right now. That's really what we're focused on with the census coming up. So this April 27th, we have a meeting. There's a little flyer. I hope it's not too tiny writing, but we'll be doing a couple things. We're supporting right now a woman who's running for the House of Delegates in Virginia. Virginia's going to be the hotbed for state legislatures this year because if people can hold and we can flip 2 seats, we'll have a Democratic legislature in Virginia. So important place. And we're also going to be writing postcards for our Louisiana. Well, we're writing to Louisiana. It's a study of if voter registration, if postcards help people actually get out and vote. And it's been done in 3 waves. The first wave went out, I think, 30,000 cards nationally to Louisiana, Mississippi, and Virginia. Said, here's why you should vote. Second card said, here's why it's not a real good idea to vote for the Republicans that are in your, where you are. And our next wave will be, and here's why it's a good idea to vote for the Democratic candidates. And we're partnering with Indivisible. They're an affiliate program, and Julie, who you all know, has bunches of postcards for Indivisible to write, and so do we. So if you want to come to Elk Grove on a Saturday morning and help us write some postcards and talk about Sister District, that would be great.
And if I recall correctly, was it Virginia where the election to determine control of the state house was determined by a coin flip last time?
Yes. Yes.
So one more vote would have changed the control of that whole legislature. So basically one more postcard could have had the chance to flip that,
That was Virginia.
make that completely different. So let's write that extra one postcard
And
this
if you
time.
feel like contributing to any of the Virginia candidates, you can look at Sister District's website. Everything goes through ActBlue. It doesn't go to Sister District. They need money, unfortunately, running campaigns is expensive. So if you want to drop $20 or something to some of the Virginia candidates, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
And then do we have any other postcard events or anything?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was gonna, so there's another little handout back there that has, on a bunch of things going on, but on every Sunday, there's a postcard event. I think it's a Sister District thing, the Sunday
Well,
thing
it's not
that,
us, but
they're writing the postcards for you, right? So, Mighty Oaks, and it's Democratic headquarters, so that information's on another little handout back there. And they're doing something every Sunday from now until the 2020 election, but they are hard by.
They have letters, they have postcards, and they also have phone banking. So they have people doing a little bit of everything.
1033 S Street, 1 o'clock every Sunday.
Right, and it's on that handout. And I also just wanted to call people's attention to Swing Left is doing a letter writing campaign to register voters in various states and also for certain races. And you can do it at home. So there's a link on our website where you can just click in and you can actually say, I'll write 5 letters to voters, to potential Democratic voters in whatever state. And they'll give you the addresses and the letter that you print out, and then you write part of it yourself and put it in an envelope and mail it. So you can do as few as 5 or as many as you want, like do your own postcard party, whatever. So there's a link again on our events page and on our daily actions page to do that. So if you're just like at home and you want to be like checking out some letters to register voters or to advocate in certain state races, you can just do that from online for the Vote Forward campaign through Swing Left.
Great. Thank you. And Scott.
Well, since somebody else mentioned April 27, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Sacramento Mighty Oaks.
Yeah,
It's-
they're the ones doing the postcard.
Well, we are affiliated with Sister, for what I'm going to talk about on April
Okay.
27th. We're affiliated with Sister District, with Swing Left, and it's a potluck from 1 to 4 p.m. on Saturday, April 27, and it's about a chance for those who are for electing progressive candidates, not just in California but wherever, because we use phone texting and phone banking, we use a variety of techniques, not the Republican ones, but we use legitimate techniques. Anyway, this is at 2108 Gerber Avenue. That's a home, so don't be looking for great big buildings, but that's a home. It's, so that's 2108 Gerber Avenue, Saturday, April 27th, 1 to 4 p.m. It's a potluck, but if you're like me and you never cook and you never buy anything, I mean, what you buy is what you eat, come anyway. Don't worry about the potluck part. Just I'd rather have you. And there will be just a discussion of, you know, things that we can do to get progressives elected. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. And then did I see one more hand up over there too? No, you're okay. All right, anybody else? This was a very lively meeting tonight, like I was saying. It was just a very good energy here in the crowd tonight. So thanks everybody. Have a great month. And hopefully it's all